Kevin ran away.
Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for ADAA's professional webinar, Becoming a Media Savvy Professional, Best Practices for Effective and Ethical Communication with Reporters. My name is Jolie Busby, and I'm the Education and Training Manager here at ADAA. So a little housekeeping for today's session. This webinar is being recorded. Closed captioning and translation are available. All attendees will receive a link to the recording within 48 hours. This webinar is Q&A enabled, so we encourage all participants to ask questions through the Q&A features. And now I'm pleased to introduce today's speakers. Dr. Melissa Hunt is a licensed clinical psychologist and serves as the Associate Director of Clinical Training in the Department of Psychology at the University of Pennsylvania. Dr. Simon Rigo is the Chief of Psychology and Director of Psychology Training at Montefiore Medical Center and Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at Albert Einstein College of Medicine in the Bronx, New York. Dr. L. Kevin Chapman is a licensed clinical psychologist, founder and director of the Kentucky Center for Anxiety and Related Disorders. And Dr. Anne Marie Albano is a professor of medical psychology, a clinical psychologist, and board certified in clinical child and adolescent psychology. Welcome to all of our presenters. I'm now going to pass the presentation over to Melissa.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I've got a few slides to go through just to kind of orient our audience and give a little structure to our conversation. But then I'm really going to hand the conversation over to my esteemed and knowledgeable colleagues here on the webinar with us. And we're really going to, I think, get to hear from each of them about their experiences and their advice and tips for interacting successfully with the media. All right, so let me go ahead and share my screen and make sure that I'm getting set up right. Oops, of course, I forgot to put it in presentation mode. There we go. And I want to switch those two. Boy, you'd think I'd be better at this point. Screen. Sorry. There used to be a way to hide presenter view. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I'm going to switch which screen I'm sharing. There we go. Okay, now I've got it. All right, so welcome everybody. So this is a presentation on media savvy. And I'm just going to kind of walk you through the why, what, how, and wheres of this topic. All right, so, oops, it's not advancing. There we go. So why? Why is it important to be media savvy? Well, most of us are clinical scientists, and we all publish scientific articles in professional journals, or we have an enormous amount of expertise in clinical psychology. That's great. That's a fabulous format for communicating with other clinical scientists. But it's important to remember that most people don't read scientific articles. And that includes the lay public, it includes politicians and policymakers. So even if they wanted to, most articles are behind paywalls or are too technical and difficult to understand for a lot of people. So if you want to influence public health and public policy, you need to communicate your findings and your expertise more broadly than simply publishing in the scientific literature. One way to go is to write books like self-help books. Those are helpful, but they have really limited reach. People are only going to find them if they know to look for them. But there's another solution, which is the media. So that includes traditional journalism. It includes podcasts. It includes social media. All of these formats have much, 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 much broader reach and impact than anything we do as individual clinical scientists. So how do you do this? Well, the first thing that you have to do, and if you want to communicate using the media, is to establish lines of communication and make yourself available to the press and to the people who control these sort of communication channels for the broader public. If you are at a university or an academic medical center, They all have communications offices with media professionals in them. They can issue press releases. They can write up articles. They can give your name to journalists who call looking for experts. Lots of experts will call Mount Sinai or University of Pennsylvania or, where Montefiore, wherever it is, saying, hey, I need an expert to comment on this study that's about to be released or something like that. Trust me, you will end up getting more journalist queries than you can reply to, often around topics that you may not even have expertise in, and then you have to decide which ones to take and which ones not. You can write an op-ed for a local newspaper. Major metropolitan newspapers love to have local experts write op-eds for them on topics that are relevant to the community. You can reach out to local radio shows or podcasters and offer a story idea. Ideally, you want to time your outreach to these outlets with the publication of new findings. The media really likes things that are hot off the presses, so that's a great way to do it. Okay, now what? We know the why and the where. Now the what. What should you be communicating? So effective communication with the media means presenting your findings and the underlying science in a way that is valid, not too technical, and definitive. And this is one of these difficult dialectics between the valid and the definitive, because, we all know that science is not always definitive. Often we can't directly establish the causal links, or we're not really sure, or, the study certainly suggests but doesn't prove. The problem is that when we use language like that, when we're communicating with the lay public or with politicians, it gives too much wiggle room and too much ambiguity. If you have a real take-home point, make it. I was listening to a radio interview just about a month ago with a cardiologist who was being interviewed after LeBron James's son, suffered a cardiac arrest during basketball practice. And there were all kinds of conspiracy theories swirling around about how it happened to him because he had received the COVID vaccine. And the cardiologist completely missed the opportunity to dismiss that fear and to make clear that that was not what had caused Bronny James's cardiac arrest. And I remember sitting in the car kind of yelling at the radio saying, dude, what a missed opportunity to really drive home a point for the public. Okay, so how do you kind of go about this when you're actually talking to a journalist? And this is where I wanted to bring a little bit of ethics. I teach our ethics course. I do a lot of work in the domain of professional ethics and thinking about how to teach and train people ethics. There's a very interesting conundrum here, which is that journalistic ethics state very clearly that reporters should not allow their sources, that's us, we're their sources, to edit their copy. So they don't typically show you the story before it gets published because they don't want sources going in and tweaking and reneging on things and so on. But psychological ethics requires that we ensure that any public statements attributed to us are scientifically and professionally accurate. I want you to think about this for a minute, because misquotes or quotes taken out of context or scientific findings being misinterpreted can do significant harm. Now, I don't want to scare anybody off of, working with the media, but if you're going to do it, you've got to do it well. So I want to draw your attention to our APA, ethics code, section 5.02 and section 5.04. When psychologists provide public advice or comment via print, internet, or other electronic transmission, they take precautions to ensure that statements are based on their professional knowledge, training, or experience in accord with appropriate psychological literature and practice. So if the journalist has misunderstood something or is framing something in a way that is genuinely inaccurate, that's on us to figure that out and correct that before it is released. And I want to point out that I have always found that making this explicit to journalists results in them and their editors allowing me to check quotes for accuracy and context. I sometimes get a little bit of pushback initially from the journalist who's, oh, well, you know, when I say I'd really like to see this before it goes to press, I would like to check it for accuracy. Every once in a while, a lower level journalist will say, oh, well, you know, I need to check with my editor. But I frame it this way. It has never failed to result in my having the opportunity to check the copy. So I really encourage people to do that. I do want to share one little cautionary tale out of my very own university. Lack of media savvy can be really problematic. A few years ago, a press release went out from the Penn Communications office about a really interesting study out of psychiatry that showed that sleep deprivation had antidepressant effects. Now, of course, we all know this, right? That's a sort of neurobiological oddity that's been around for a long time. This was a new study that was investigating some of the underlying mechanisms. But it got picked up by media outlets as sleep deprivation is an effective treatment for depression. That's better than meds or it's therapy, right? Now, we all know that that's not true. You can't use sleep deprivation as an effective treatment. But the way it got framed, it sounded like, oh, go home and try this at home, folks. I personally, just me, one little clinical psychologist, saw 3 patients the following week, 2 in our assessment clinic and 1 in my private practice, who had tried it because they had seen a write-up about it with absolutely disastrous results. One of them triggered a manic episode, 1 failed an exam because she fell asleep, and 1 got in an accident because she was falling asleep at the wheel. Yikes, this had really bad outcomes. I think had the authors of the study had a chance to vet the press release before it went out, they might have been able to correct that misunderstanding. Okay, so now just a couple of success stories on my part, and then I'm going to shut up and hand it over to my colleagues. I have sort of a couple of main lines of work where working with the press has been enormously helpful. One is my work on the ill effects of social media on well-being, especially for adolescents and emerging adults. We had an initial press release. I got a lot of interviews and requests for expert comments. I still, to this day, I get about 1 every week or 2. I get some random journalist asking me, you know, when the actor who played Spider-Man decided to step away from social media, immediately like 6 reporters called me. This eventually led to an interview with the Surgeon General's office as they prepared their reports on loneliness and social media, right? There's public policy at play. And I have currently been contracted as an expert consultant in a large-scale multi-state legal action against a particular social media company that has the potential to have a massive impact on legal and public policy on how this, you know, how social media affects young people. None of that would ever have happened if I had just published that article in a scientific journal and not issued a press release about it at the same time, that initial seminal article. So that's, I mean, like, that's cool. That's exciting, right? To really have the opportunity to have the ear of people who are in power and bring good science to bear on these kinds of debates. This is science in the public interest. Oh, and I'm getting paid to be an expert consultant, so that's fun. The other main domain I work in is health psychology. ADAA has been terrific at disseminating some of those things with things like public webinars, which I still get patient referrals to this day from folks who have come across my public webinar on GI disorders. Traditional media has been hugely helpful. CNN did a story and actually interviewed one of my patients who was very, very glad to be interviewed and sort of spread the word. I've been on podcasts. I have a Psychology Today blog. Psychology Today actually reached out to me and asked me to write that blog. All of this leads to more book sales of my self-help books, more patient referrals, and importantly, it gives me the opportunity to educate the public about CBT for GI conditions like irritable bowel syndrome and other things. So it's really exciting to have the opportunity to spread the word about clinical science in a way that's actually going to have an impact in the world beyond our conversations with each other in journals and at conferences. All right, so that's my kind of framework for all of this. And now I would so love to hand it over to my esteemed colleagues and let them each share their wisdom. Simon, you're on the top left of my screen, so why don't you go first?
Happy to start, and thank you, Melissa. That was a great overview. Really appreciated it. And you made a lot of points that I had swirling in my head, but in a much more organized way. So I appreciate the frame. The way I may diverge slightly from what you said is I do not publish a whole bunch of papers. I'm PsyD. I went to school because my PsyD program, because my passion was more on the clinical side, although I'm a consumer of the research and have published a few things. That has not been the strength or the focus of my career. But related to what you talked about, what I've always been passionate about is dissemination. And I view the work in educating the thank you, Kevin, the public about the findings from colleagues like yourself and Dr. Chapman and Dr. Albano. I consume the literature. I try to digest the literature. I try to come up with my core piece, as you said, boil it down to something that's valid but simple. And then my version of dissemination has always been to then take it directly to the people who may not hear about it. And you mentioned, I think very accurately, I don't think we read our own journals. I was going to tease you and say, tell me the table of contents of the last journal you published in, Dr. Hunt, and see how many articles we can name in our own. And so I agree, we have to do more, not only for our colleagues, but for the public as well. And I love that you mentioned the scalability of everything. There is a tremendous value in speaking to your local outlet, like the AM New York newspaper that gets handed to every person boarding the subways trains is a great way to disseminate local knowledge and programmatic information about our hospital, but also just reaching an audience who wants something to do on the subway. And to me, that's as good as the big outlets, the big traditional media outlets like the New York Times or CNN or NBC or the other major media outlets. There's a place for everyone, and there's a purpose to everything, and they all need people with expertise to comment on what's being generated by the literature, or what's going on in the news today. So I think if you're attending this webinar, you've got an expertise that's could be shared. Everyone should be empowered to share that wisdom with the general public, because by the virtue of your degree, you've got training and expertise that could be shared for someone who needs it. And if we don't, the piece you didn't touch on directly, although you hinted at it with the study you talked about, is there's a lot of misinformation out there these days, especially on social media. And if we don't lend our voices to the discussions, I really worry about the impact that news has on people who can't really discern what is evidence-based from what's not, or what the finding of this study means versus it when placed into the context of the real world. So I get a tremendous pleasure and satisfaction out of contributing to that part of the dissemination piece. And I, maybe unlike you, the other piece I made is I will say yes to everyone. I don't discern. If you want me to talk to your audience, I will say, yeah, I sure, I'll fit it in. And I try to stay on message to something that I think is valid and central to me. And that is my version of it. My bullseye is that I know CBT works. We can debate the who and for what circumstances, but there's enough there to say CBT can be helpful to people. So as long as I have that, almost everything I've ever done, at some point in the story, I say the exact same thing. It doesn't matter if it's to CNN or if it's to Better Home and Gardens. I'm finding a way to talk about how CBT can be very helpful for whatever the story is about. There's one, someone just did an interview with me. It's going to be, I think, probably next week for Memorial Day weekend. They were talking about like stress around travel and travel planning. I think it'll be on Yahoo Health. But it's still, I talked about cognitive interventions and behavioral interventions to deal with stress. So it's redundant, but I think the world needs redundancy. And I will stop being redundant because I've taken up too much time, and I will punt it. Do you want to punt it to whoever's next on the screen, Melissa? But thank you for that piece.
Thanks. And Simon, we may circle back to you because clearly you have connections with lots of outlets. And I think for a lot of people in the audience, there will be a big kind of like, well, how do you get Yahoo Health to call you, right? So we'll circle back around to that. But Kevin, you're next on my screen as I go around the circle. So can I hand it off to you?
You can hand it off to me. Well, first and foremost, let me say this. First of all, thank you for having me. I'm honored to be a part of this esteemed panel of friends and colleagues, frankly, friends and colleagues. Anne-Marie and Simon are the absolute experts. I love both of them dearly. And I just want to point out that something that they bring to the table that's important for everyone that's a part of this discussion to understand is that notice the style that everyone has on the panel. We can talk technical, but we also are very warm, right? And also very sound bitey. So I just want to point that out as something that I respect about Simon and Anne-Marie is they're very tactful in the media, but they're also very warm and personable as well. And that's an attribute that you need to tuck away because again, we're all trained to be that with our clients and patients, and the media is no different in that way. So I guess, Melissa, you did a good job of serving this up. So I'll just kind of go through some of the notes that I made in terms of my involvement with the media. So like Simon and Anne-Marie and you, Melissa, I've done popular press and things like that. And I've done quite a bit of programming on TV as well. And I think there's some caveats for that. So that's something I can really speak to as well. And I know Anne-Marie's done some of that as well. So something you said, Melissa, that I want to point out is you mentioned valid, not too technical, definitive. The two things I'd add to that is make sure that you're personable and speak in sound bites. Journalists in the media love sound bites. They don't want too much information. They want you to hit the highlights and to be as pithy as possible so that the average person can really hear what you're saying. And that includes interviews, but it also includes, media programming. They want sound bites, right? So that's really important is to like Melissa's point, it's well taken, but sound bites and being really pithy is very important. Something I'll say, Melissa, which I think might alleviate one of the questions somebody may have at some point is semantics do matter. And I want to give an example. So I was the program expert on My Strange Addiction, Still Addicted, the most recent season. And what's interesting about my involvement with that, I knew the producers for some time, is that the semantics matter because many of the people on that show historically don't have addictions, right? So one of the very important points, what I mean about that is in terms of semantics is that I made it very clear to the producers, which listened, that I'm not calling any of these behaviors addictions, right? So I think that's really important because historically, so many people involved in the media from where we sit oftentimes just go with it because they like to be on camera, when in reality, our ethics and integrity matter more. So it's important for us to say, wait a second, we can speak to learned associations, we can speak to anxiety, we can speak to symptomology, but I'm not calling it something that it's not. And they heard that because it's in their best interest, and I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear, for them to not make the expert look bad. That's very important to convey now. So I want to get that out of the way. It's just some of my chicken scratch notes. So semantics do in fact matter. Something else I'll say is that many of the journalists, I know you all would agree with this, do reach out and ask you if this is accurate or not. One good example is I was interviewed, I think it was US News and World Report, about caffeine and anxiety, and they switched the quotes with me and the psychiatrist, which is a significant problem. Though what they said wasn't inaccurate, I didn't say it. I wasn't talking about an overactive limbic system, though we're trained to. Nonetheless, I spoke directly to the anxiety and how we, implement caffeine with exposures and things like that. So I responded immediately once I read it, and they corrected it. So that was good. So I just want to point out as well is that many times they do reach out and ask you if this is accurate. Many people don't reach out, though, as you mentioned, Melissa, but some do. So that's something else I wanted to say with that. And I think the last thing I'll say, and then I'll pass it over to Anne-Marie after that for some dialogue, some tips. I'd just say we have to remember to practice what we preach. And what I mean by that is that it's really exposure to be involved in the media for many of us. We're not really trained to do that. And I think in some sense, we tell our clients and patients to engage in hard things and to engage in, new learning and concepts therein. It's essential for us because in the past, I think it's gotten much better. But in the past, there's been just anyone on TV representing our field. And that's why we have so much misinformation. Everyone on this webinar is skilled enough to do what we do, period. You are. So the other thing I'd say is you're not an imposter. Simon alluded to that. You're an expert. And although you may be early in your career, you have the best training possible to speak to these concerns in the media. And if you don't, someone who's less qualified is going to speak to it. In fact, someone in another discipline is going to speak to things we need to be speaking about. And it adds fuel to the fire for that misinformation. So that's the last thing I'll say. I'll shut up and then I'll pass it over to my beloved Dr. Anne Marie Albano.
I love you, Kevin.
Love you
I
too.
do. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here with us today. And Melissa and ADAA, thanks for having us. Boy, everything you all said, plus, let me just say this. I was working with my master's degree in the early 1980s in the area of child abuse and neglect. And it was for some nonprofit organizations. And I was trained to speak to the public by these two incredible women in South Florida who started this agency, Kids in Distress. And this is where I learned to talk about mental health in youth and adults to the public in ways that could reach them, reach their hearts and their minds, help them understand. And at the point where I was, it was also to help raise money for these nonprofits. And it's related to what you all were saying. You have to speak simply in a lot of ways because you're speaking to a wide range of people who come from different backgrounds in various ways, maybe different cultures, what have you. It's not dumbing things down. That's not what you're doing, but you're speaking in plain language and taking the jargon out. And when you do that, it really raises awareness and opens people's minds in ways that I saw that was quite powerful. Not just for the agencies I was working with, but also just making a difference for the lives of the kids and talking with their parents and their relatives. So that was a big lesson, is in speaking plainly. And then over the time, I've done all kinds of media. And the thing that I have a couple of things that I've learned. Number one is, especially when it comes for the health and wellness sections, let's say, of newspapers or of any television news shows and what have you, a lot of times, as we've heard, they want to see patients. They want patient stories or they want patients on film. And we have to be very mindful to be careful and take care of and protect our patients and the people that we might be talking about or be presenting or asking to go on TV. The worst thing that I think ever happened for me was a whole group of socially anxious teenagers here in New York City, and they had real diagnosed social anxiety disorder. They agreed to go on a series and do a series of them being videotaped in our cognitive behavioral group treatment for social anxiety group. They did exposures out in public that the cameraman followed them around, and nothing was ever used. After like 10 hours of following these kids and interviews and stuff, they never used any of this material. The disappointment for these kids, on the one hand, they weren't exploited in a way on TV or whatever, but the disappointment. There's so many ways that we just want to be mindful of not identifying kids or putting things out there that can haunt somebody. And then the other thing is, again, having them do something that just compounds their, anxiety or their upset. So I'm always careful about that. And I like to use composites of people, in some of the stories and such that I might use in the media. I will just say to you all, after doing all kinds of media and stuff, I think the best thing for me was developing relationships with reporters. Andrea Peterson, Wall Street Journal, love her dearly. She's not just a go-to for her articles, but I'm in her book because, she learns how to trust those of us in the area. And this starts with you calling your local papers, calling and putting yourself out there, as we're saying, to local radio shows, you name it. And when you get to know reporters, just you let them know. I tell them it's not just me. I can get you in touch with Kevin Chapman. I can get you in touch with Melissa Hunt and my colleague who can speak on a topic that they're expert in that I might not be, or that you could hear more information from. So I think that's a big thing, is making up, if you can, develop relationships with these folks. And I'll leave it at that. I've had a good run with the media. Want to preserve that. And I think, again, it's up to us to disseminate accurate information. So that's why I talk to them when I can and when I'm asked to.
All right, I want to take a couple of minutes to address a few things that have come up in the chat. So thank all three of you so much for elaborating and furthering and giving more detail and depth to what we were talking about here. There's a question in the chat from Lynn Sickerlin, Helen, that her hesitance is most requests have asked for patience, and she doesn't feel that kids can give consent in the present and doesn't have any idea in the future. And I agree 100%. I would never do that. I wanted to clarify that the one patient who was interviewed and filmed on CNN was someone who I knew would be interested in doing it. I did not obviously give the radio, the television station, that person's name and number. I contacted the patient myself and said, hey, they're doing this story. And I knew he kind of had the fervor of a convert because, he had been through so many other treatments and nothing had worked. And then he worked with me and it was like, oh, this is what I should have been doing all along. So he was an adult, completely compos mentis, very much in a position to consent for himself and felt good about spreading the word. I don't think I would ever take a patient who was more fragile or in the middle of treatment still, or a minor and unable to really give consent on their own behalf. I don't think I would ever hand them over to the press. But that said, even if they ask for patience, you can tell them, I'm sorry, that's not possible because of patient confidentiality, but I would be happy to do a mock session with our administrative assistant to, show you what the therapy might look like or something like that. And I have lots of things up on YouTube that I've done with administrative assistants and students and undergrads sort of playing mock patients. And so you can still demo the thing in a very engaging and illustrative way without in any way compromising real patient confidentiality. So that's just a thought. But I do want to come back to our panelists because all three of you have said, when I do media, or I've gotten this interview, or I've done a lot of television shows. Bless you, Kevin. I've only been on TV once. And it was with a local TV morning show. And thank goodness I switched the seats with myself and my young undergraduate who had worked on the study with me. Because as soon as we got off air, my husband called me and said, wow, what was up with the handsy host who kept touching me throughout the interview, which was creepy and weird. And I went to the producer of the show afterwards and I said, just so you know, you guys are courting a lawsuit here and somebody needs to tell him to keep his hands off the guests. And her mother immediately also emailed me and said, oh my God, thank you so much for not putting my daughter next to him. But so, there's some cautionary tales in all of this for sure. But I would love to hear from each of you a little bit more about how did you start to make those connections? Kevin, how on earth did you end up as the expert consultant on this show, right? Because I think for a lot of folks in our audience here, this probably all feels kind of mysterious and they don't even necessarily know how to start.
Yeah, that's a great question, Melissa. So if I go backwards, so doing the My Strange Addiction, I was also the program consultant for 60 Days In for 2 seasons as well. The same producers who did that show on TLC also did that show on A&E. But what started the media for me was doing good science, publishing, writing, And as a professor, my area was the family transmission of anxiety and looking at that in African American families as compared to non-Hispanic white families. So the first media project that I was involved in, the producer found me because she was scouring the literature and looking on Google for psychologists of color and psychologists who could speak to anxiety in diverse populations in particular. So this was just me writing and publishing in manuscripts and book chapters and what have you. And she found me that way because she was, and this was for Nickelodeon, by the way. So I did something for Nick News where they did a documentary on kids who struggle with anxiety, and they wanted a diverse cast in that way who could speak to those different areas. So they didn't want it to be completely white for obvious reasons. So they wanted to include some diversity in that regard, and I could speak to that, right? So that's what launched it. And as Anne-Marie, and I think Anne-Marie in particular mentioned this, but once you do that, right, people start to find you at that point. It's the proverbial, you build it, they will come. So once you've done one thing and developed these relationships, as Anne-Marie noted, they start finding out the who's who, and then you get names from colleagues like they mentioned as well. And then it kind of sky's the limit at that point in terms of how much involvement you want. So just doing good science and actually doing the things we're trained to do is how I got found for my first media project.
And let me just say, the first time I went on television was in the early 90s in Miami. I think it was within a matter of like a month of my starting my very first real professional job with my master's degree at this child abuse agency. And not having ever done anything like this before, the interviewer live on television, and mind you, my whole family is watching from home in Pompano Beach. We have a nice interview going back and forth about, issues with kids that wind up in foster care and this, that, and the other. And then he looks at me and he says, "So tell me a success story." I had none. I just started this job. I was like, wow. Anyway, by the time, I don't even remember what I said, but all I know is when I got home that night, my mother looked at me, she goes, "What the heck happened to you? You were blasted there." This taught me that you can ask and should ask, what are the questions you want me to answer? And so ahead of time, whether it's for print or whether it's for video or podcast, you should get what are the questions or what are the topics we're going to go through so that I'm ready for it. And also just, role play with your colleagues, with your friends, how interviews can go, because that was the first time, but it was not the last time that curveballs come your way. And, you learn how to roll with that. We're all about flexibility within fidelity, right? So anyhow, and, it didn't really get in my way overall. But as Kevin's saying, it was a process over time and, developing expertise, getting out there with publishing in various ways. And publishing isn't just in the major journals. There are some really great ways of publishing, as, Melissa said, not just there's opinion pieces. You can write op-eds and you can write different kinds of advertorial articles. And then also a lot of the great clinical journals, Cognitive and Behavioral Practice, for example, Evidence-Based Practice in Child and Adolescent Mental Health and such. You can write clinical articles that you then can send to your local papers or to, reporters that you are familiar with to say, hey, this is an angle you may want to look at given the state of mental health of kids or in behavioral medicine in this topic area, what have you.
Maybe I'll jump in and I'll say to Henry's point, I think my first experience was I was at University of Pennsylvania doing my postdoc, and there were calls that would come into the center where I was from journalists and reporters asking for comments on stories. And other than our director, who frequently commented on those stories, it was hard to get other people on the faculty to take that risk and do it. So one of those calls came through and I said, all right, I'll take a shot at it, because it was part of my dissemination idea. And it was like it doesn't even exist anymore, I don't think, MindSpring. It was like a blog site that a person interviewed me from the Orthodox Jewish community that's near Pennsylvania, Philly, where I was, about scrupulosity and OCD. And that's 20 years ago this fall, I think, in 2004. And I was terrified. I had notes and scribble. This was like, I think it was by the phone because I don't think they could see me. And I had Post-its everywhere with facts and data, and it had nothing to do with any of that. They just wanted to know about OCD and scrupulosity. But that started it. And I think to add to a couple of points, one is I think media tend to copy one another. So once it's out there, other journalists and reporters look and see, oh, that's an interesting angle. And then you get a call from another outlet saying, we saw this, could we talk to you about it, or something similar? And it starts to snowball. I find it tends to go in waves through the media. And then if you keep either through LinkedIn or your own website or some way of noting what you've done, it become searchable. And then the media looking for experts, when they search, find your site and find what you've done, either through snippets or through references or clippings, and it builds a brand recognition. Even if they've not worked with you, I think they tend to look for experiences that, like your own portfolio of snippets. So I think that really helps. And then just to loop back to one thing that you said, Melissa, and Kevin said, is you with someone wanting a kiddo to be part of the interview, and Kevin with the addiction term, it's okay to say no. It's okay I think sometimes we get excited and we have a chance, and this is our big break, and you don't want to say no because you want a chance. But if it's not right, I can almost guarantee if you just keep doing what you're doing, another wave will come and you'll have things that will be appealing to you, and with the right reporter that you can trust and you build a relationship with. As Anne-Marie said, it's so important to not be pressured into saying or doing things or committing to things that aren't ethical or that you're just uncomfortable with. So there'll be other chances. There's so many outlets nowadays through social media and traditional media that need content every day. And if you're just patient and plug away, and people will come to you and ask for your opinion.
So to pick up on that, Simon, thank you so much for making that point, and Stephanie for your comment that a CNN reporter wanted you to say something that just wasn't accurate. One of the things that journalists, traditional journalists especially, are often trained to do is that they're supposed to have an angle. Now, it's sort of similar to science in that we have a hypothesis when we do the study, but for us, we have a hypothesis and we're testing it. For the reporters, they have an angle, and they're trying to find material that fits the angle. And I have occasionally found that a journalist with an angle will try to box you into saying something that is simply not accurate, or at the very least, it's not useful, right? It's just sort of not the right way to think about the topic. And I'm not quite sure why journalists are trained that way, but they clearly are still. And so I really want to echo what all three other folks are saying here, which is you have expertise. Yes, Stephanie, saying no is so important. If your little internal alarm bells are going off, oh, this doesn't really feel accurate, use your expertise, use your position. James Kumarasani for the BBC attempted to back me into a corner on something. And there I was on the BBC morning radio show. And I said, no, that's not right, to James Kumarasani from the BBC. Don't hesitate to push back and to frame things in the way that you know is accurate and a real reflection of the underlying science.
Yeah, and if I could just add, when I get, through my inbox or our public relations office here at Columbia University Medical Center, New York Presbyterian, they will, say, will you do this interview with this reporter? I go online and I look at what that reporter has written or talked about. And I have a do not fly list. I have reporters I won't say names, but I just have reporters that I will not talk to because they hammer away and they have an angle. And the angle is oftentimes the ones I won't talk with are sensationalism, anti-science, and really politicizing issues of the human condition. That is just appalling the way that it's done. So I stick to my values when it comes to that. And those are the people I turn down. But you should you actually should really, and you can Google and look up, what are these people written about? How do they report on all kinds of issues? And does that fit with what you know that you want to say and present based on the data that you know?
So I'm wondering if anyone in the audience has any more specific questions. It seems like some of the folks in the audience really have already had contact with the media and have, maybe wondered if there are ways to do it better. I'm curious if there's anyone in the audience who's really never done the media, as we keep putting it, who's, anxious about it, or if there are any, stuck points for you. I loved the way Kevin framed this in terms of exposure therapy, right? That we need to do things that may feel outside our comfort zone, or outside of our wheelhouse a little bit, because otherwise, how do we ever learn new skills? So if anyone wants to, no one's using the Q&A, that's fine. We can just use the chat. If someone wants to throw out into the chat there any concerns that they have about how to get started on this, anything that anyone wants to throw in there, we'd love to address whatever concerns people actually. I mean, we can certainly just keep talking. I think all four of us are very good at that.
Yeah, well, let me just say this. One of the things, I mean, I'm head of a clinic here at Columbia University. I'm head of a new center at New York Presbyterian Hospital. And one of the things that I'm doing this coming summer is we are doing media training for our new faculty, early career people. We're going to be doing role playing, all kinds of stuff. And one, I think as senior people, as I'm a senior person in the field, and those of you out there who are, senior in your arenas, it's on us to get our new folks and our young folks out there. And so I would encourage folks to think about, and maybe ADAA can help facilitate some media training where there's role playing and, folks being tough reporters, various things like that. We could have a lot of fun with it at the conference, let's say next year or some, over time. But I think that's another thing, is it's incumbent on us to help our younger and early career faculty and colleagues in practice and stuff to get time in the press. So that I just want to say that.
I can add to that too, Henry. I think there was a time when APA was doing that. They had an option for professional media training, and there's a kit, I think, still on their website on how to interact and talk with the media. Maybe a little dated, and I'm not sure if Columbia does this still, but our media relations department here occasionally does something very similar to what you'll do with your new hires, which is prep people in cohorts to when there's enough people who are newer and want the training to. There's a house couple down where they simulate like a set of a show, and they can use it if the media come here for a nice backdrop, but they can also use it to, as you said, role play away and get people more comfortable with different styles of interacting, whether it's a standing interview or a sitting interview, and what to wear and things. They give you all these pointers, and you have to be a little thick-skinned because they're trying to get you to perform in a way that's, as you said, digestible and relatable, and as Kevin said, like warm and relatable. So sometimes we do things that they're going to point out that we need to correct, and that's okay. And the other thing I'll just add is with all the role playing and with all the experience, I still get anxious doing these things. I think I had one of my true bona fide panic attacks it was like Good Morning America Live. And there was a variety of circumstances on set where they moved me and they had me, but when I was in like basically a closet, they had to move me because there was too many panelists on the set, and there's a big camera with the red light. And when I saw them say you got like 5 and it's going to switch to, and then the light came on, I think I dissociated. I know my heart was palpitating. It was, I don't even remember. I thank goodness they taped it, because I don't remember. If you look, you'll probably see me blinking for a bit and trying to swallow, and that's okay, because that's exposure, right? I didn't die. It wasn't a catastrophe. It's reasonable to get anxious because we think about, our minds create the scenarios, like, what are my colleagues going to think? How am I going to embarrass? All that chitter chatter is par for the course of doing something that hopefully is meaningful to you, but hard sometimes. So I think that it's okay to accept that if you value the work and the mission, along the way, you may blow it a couple of times. I've been misquoted. It's out there. You can find horrific, even with trying to correct them. And sometimes there's one that got translated from English to another language and back to English, and the back to English version makes me sound like I'm on some sort of substance. It's totally incoherent, and they credit me as captain of thinking training at Montefiore, which is not a title I hold at Montefiore. But so they're out there, and I'm still okay, and I'm still saying yes. And I think the broader mission, thank you for that, Dr. Chapman, is like to accept that's part of the process. That's what we need to do. Sorry, so that's my soapbox to try to encourage you to do it.
I guess I'd say something real quick. Of course, Simon and Anne-Marie both spoke to this already, but like Anne-Marie, and I know Simon has a plethora of knowledge in this area for sure, because we've done panels like this before with social media. But someone asked a question as it relates to what would be a good starting place. And like Anne-Marie, you know, we do these weekly didactics at our center where we talk about, when we're training, right, social anxiety and panic and the things, right, insomnia, CBTI, but we have a social media one, right? So we do one that talks about not only for doctoral students, but also early career professionals about how to utilize social media and other platforms to disseminate. This is why we do it. It's good dissemination, period. It's an epicenter of dissemination. So I'd say that to say that based on one of the questions, Instagram, and I know Simon could definitely speak to that, is a gold mine to begin with if someone's interested in using social media in particular to disseminate good information, because there's tons of reels and stories and there's logistics involved in that. But that's something that can be scheduled, and it's not something that necessarily takes a lot of time, but that's a really good starting place for people who are interested in the social media piece.
I think the only thing I'd add too, though, is get yourself your own website. Go to Kevin Chapman's website and look at this guy's personal website, because it is a fantastic in showing, you know, it's a dissemination like gold mine of showing CBT, his work. It has videos, it has incredible information for people. But get yourself a website, because on your Instagram or Facebook or wherever you're doing this, you put your website link. And that's a place where, too, these reporters and journalists will come to find you. They'll hunt a little bit more and dig deeper into your website. So, and Kevin, I'm sorry, you've got one of the best websites ever out there. So anyway.
I wasn't aware of that, so I appreciate that shout out, Anne-Marie. Thank you.
The only other place where it can be useful to invest a little bit of time, but you have to be careful because it can become a bit of a gravity sinkhole for time, is Reddit. If you find a community on Reddit that has the distress or the disorder that you happen to have expertise in, you can initially just sort of start lurking and reading, and then you can start posting responses to people's comments. Wow, Reddit is a place where so much misinformation gets traded back and forth. It's kind of horrifying. And it often attracts people who are very distressed and who aren't getting good, effective, evidence-based help for whatever their disorder is. So if it's a fairly popular subreddit, you know, with even a couple of thousand people, wow, that's a pretty quick and dirty way to disseminate evidence-based treatment. Now, you do have to be a little bit careful about, you know, the nature of the non-fiduciary relationship, and, you know, you're not the clinician for these people and so on. But I have often found that just posting, hey, it sounds like you're really struggling. Have you thought about trying, you know, X, Y, or Z? I will often now suddenly get, you know, a whole bunch of people asking me for advice and direction. And, you know, I try not to engage with each of them individually, but rather to post the general, you know, spreading the gospel, spreading the CBT gospel, as Simon likes to do. So that's another place where it's kind of easy to dip your toe in and get started. All you need is a username. You don't need to be able to video yourself and, you know, post your own reels and so on. So limited reach, but in some ways a lot more reach than just us sitting in our office. So that's another thought.
I can sneak one more last thing in. there's a website called Haro, Haro, which is Help a Reporter Out, where I used to do a lot more stuff with them, but it's like think of it like there's also ProfNet, which is the same thing. There's the two major sites is Haro and ProfNet that do basically the same thing. It's like a dating service where there's one, you sign in if you're a journalist or you sign in if you're an expert, and then there's journalists posting queries, like stories they're trying to file wanting expert opinion, or as an expert you can list your topics and subjects of expertise and stay there as it's like their internal Rolodex. And if you do nothing else, but there's a free version, or if you're on social media, most of them have handles on social media, so you can follow their handles that way. And there's reporters all the time filing queries that want opinions, and you just contact them and say, I could weigh in, and they decide whether you're a good match.
All right, folks. Well, I think we're winding down. I certainly want to thank my esteemed colleagues for being willing to do this with me and being so game about jumping in and spreading the word, if you will, about the right way to spread the word. So, hopefully everyone felt like this was a useful kind of intro tutorial to Media Savvy. And thanks again to everyone for joining me. I really appreciate you all lending your amazing expertise and experience in this. Jolie, I'll hand it back to you for the last little wrap up.
Okay. Well, I know that we all value your expertise, and we thank you so much for taking the time to talk today with our attendees. And just wanted to say a little bit about ADAA. And if you're not yet a member, we invite you to view the many membership benefits that ADAA has to offer. Members enjoy webinars like the one today, blog posts from professionals, member self-help books and publications, and also ask you to consider subscribing to Insights, which is our ADAA professional newsletter. You can visit adaa.org to learn more. And also on behalf of ADAA, we thank you again for joining us. We hope to see you next time.
Take care, everyone. Bye
Bye,
now.
everybody. Thank you
Bye-bye.
all.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all.
Good to see you too, Simon.